to the Remembering a Life podcast. I'm your host, Holly Ignatowski. Today we're talking with Dr. Sara Murphy about grief and loss, but specifically the often very isolating grief we experience following the death of a friend. We're going to talk about why this particular type of loss is often overlooked and how we can be more supportive when someone we care about experiences the death of a friend. Welcome, Sara, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me back, Holly.
Today we're talking about grief and loss, but very specifically the loss of a friend. Why is it necessary for us to get this specific regarding loss and categorize it?
Well, I think one reason it's really important and valuable to talk about losses like the loss of a friend is because no one else is doing so. We know that all loss is unique, just like all of our subsequent grief experiences are unique, but there's been really very little public or even private focus on the grief that we may go through when losing a friend. Even in the field of thanatology, which is the study of death, dying, and bereavement, which is my area, there is virtually no scholarly work, nor even any anecdotal publication that focuses specifically on the loss of a friend. And, friends are the people we choose to go through life with. And for many of us, our close friends are essentially our chosen family. So I think putting a spotlight on these grief experiences that are so often overlooked isn't just important, it's necessary, because when we do lose a friend in our life, we may feel that the silence in public dialogues about death and grief that focuses in on friendship, that doesn't speak to friendship, means that we don't have the right to be grieving or talking about our grief the way that we might if we had lost a family member or a parent or a grandparent. So I think it's great that we're having this conversation because we've all gone through the loss of a friend at some point and maybe felt that we weren't being really supported in that grief.
Why do you think that we as a society look at loss differently depending on the relationship to the deceased? And as you said, someone might look at this and say, well, I lost my mom, you just lost a friend. Why do we put it in those boxes?
Yeah, that's a fantastic conversation. In my own work, I've spoken a lot about the ways in which dominant culture and institutions in dominant culture hierarchize grief experiences and hierarchize death experiences. And when we do that, we start making assumptions about the impact of death loss based on these categories of relationships, right? And I think we've all been used to hearing, well, there's nothing worse than the loss of a child. And while that may be true for many people who experience the tragic death of their children, for other people who don't lose their child through death, they might be getting messaging like, well, the hardest death you go through will be a parent. And then we start to chip away at the value of that grief, the further down the bloodline we might get, right? So even within an extended family system, the death of an aunt or uncle isn't supposed to be as important as the death of a parent, or the death of a cousin isn't supposed to be as impactful as the death of a sibling. And, this is kind of ridiculous. These are faulty assumptions, and they can be really damaging to grievers because all of our relationships are different, and our relationships within our family systems are different. And then if you look to a category like friendship, our cultural institutions don't really provide any kind of recognition in any type of impactful way for the death of a friend. You don't see businesses giving people time off if they lost a friend, maybe just a biological or maritally related person in their lives. And, I think this likely has something to do with outdated generational conceptions of the nature of what we call kinship ties, the idea that kinship ties are going to look the same for everybody, and also outdated notions of both the nuclear family and then also emotional intimacy. A lot of the people in my own life with whom I have felt the strongest emotional intimacy and connection are people I'm not related to by blood or marriage, and I think that's that's true for a lot of us. So I think in having these conversations, it's also important to recognize and push back on these cultural conceptions that, there is this hierarchy of grieving that's going to look the same for every person.
So overall, how do we support people who are grieving the loss without making those assumptions about how they might be coping based on their relationship and kind of giving a greater or lesser value to that relationship? How do we support them?
I think the best way to avoid making assumptions about anybody's grief experience is to ask questions of the griever about how they are feeling, about what their loved one brought to their life, about their favorite memories together, and to listen actively and attitudinally without imposing our own experiences of grief or making these, easy comparisons to our own losses that might then disenfranchise someone in their grief. And to be able to stay close to the griever and remember that the grief emotions after the death of a friend might be as complex as after any other death loss. So being open to listening and also offering the same kinds of supports that we would if someone lost a loved one who societally would have been deemed a more major loss is really crucial. Writing them a sympathy note and sending it, checking in from time to time, checking in on the anniversary of the death, making sure that we're keeping those lines of communication open and that we're not having a one-and-done conversation with someone who is grieving the loss of a friend. And I think more broadly, how we can best support someone who's grieving the death of a friend is to just consistently be validating the reality of their loss and the unique nature of their loss and allowing them to speak openly about their grief. And I think importantly, because it is so common for these grief experiences to be disenfranchised, to assist them if they are experiencing disenfranchisement of their grief simply because they weren't related to someone via blood or marriage, and trying to get ahead of that by saying, I know that you lost someone incredibly important in your life, and I want to be there for you and with you as you're grieving.
Naturally, we want to support the families of the lost friend, but we're doing our own grieving of our loss. How do we do that? How do we support ourselves, the family members of our lost loved one, without feeling guilty or that we're making it about ourselves?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's often a bit of a balancing act dependent on whether we also have a relationship with that family. And if we've lost a friend who's been in our life for a long time, we might well have, a cordial or even a warm and loving relationship with that family. And I think it's important to be able to avail ourselves of support from trusted sources who will not, again, disenfranchise our grief, but also to be able to sit with and co-grieve with family members of the person who has died. And when this is done well, and when this is done with everyone coming to the table with an open mind and an open heart, it can really assist someone in their grieving because you're going to be able to share perspectives and memories about the person who's died with someone who maybe didn't have that access to that part of their life, or who hadn't been on this family vacation where this funny thing happened, or who had supported us in a way that maybe the family didn't know about, but would really appreciate hearing about these qualities of their loved one and how they functioned in our lives. So I think it's very important then to be aware of and try to avoid engaging in competitive grief, either with members of our friend's family or within friend groups, right, which we've also seen happen. This sort of jockeying over, well, I was closer to them than you were, or I should be the one to speak at this memorial service because we shared this and you didn't, or you moved away. That can all be really toxic to grieving, but instead to reach toward a co-grieving that allows us to say, I lost a really important relationship here. I recognize you lost a really important relationship here, and these relationships were not the same. And I would say also, just as after any kind of loss, if we feel that we would benefit from professional support, to seek out a licensed counselor or a therapist with demonstrated expertise in grief. A good grief-specific counselor is as ready, as willing, and has the tools in their toolbox to work with someone who's lost a friend as they would to work with someone who's lost a sibling or a parent or a partner.
Sara, do you think it's common for people to perhaps feel guilty or a sense of their own mortality, very anxious after losing a friend? Because oftentimes, if we lose a friend, they're usually close in age to us. How do we deal with those feelings?
Yeah, I think you're bringing up also a question of lifespan considerations, and I think that's also really important to pay attention to, because while we may have friends who run the gamut of the lifespan, I certainly have been blessed to have friends even now who are from their 20s to their 70s. If we are losing someone close to us in age, another thing to consider, and this goes for how we support people who've lost someone too, are lifespan considerations of where we are in the biopsychosocial development stage. So, thinking about an adolescent who loses a friend, a peer, and the challenges that might be specific to their grief might look very, very different from someone who is in an older population. But even so, we need to resist, again, hierarchizing those losses or assuming one will be harder or easier to navigate. I think when we lose someone close to us in age, and I'm thinking specifically about even the death of a friend from high school 5 years ago for myself, you really do need to sit and confront your own mortality, whether that death was expected or not. And I think there is sometimes feelings of shock and disturbance dependent upon when in the lifespan that loss happens, of thinking, well, this is out of order, or this shouldn't be happening to me yet. I'm prepared maybe to lose a grandparent at this point, but not a friend. And along with lifespan considerations, something else I would encourage people to think about is the particular complexity and care that might need to be taken after a means of death that is stigmatized or sudden or traumatic. And these might call for additional supports, because that sense of shock or that sense of being blindsided by the death, and also the weight of something that might be a stigmatized cause of death, like an addiction-related death, like suicide, like homicide, might come with a lot of attendant complication to grief that also might really warrant for more professional intervention for the friends who are grieving in addition to the family.
How do we start that conversation when we want to talk to others about the loss of our friend with perhaps other mutual friends or the family of our friend? How do we begin that conversation that leads to the support and the healing?
I think this is a tricky question. One, because I think these conversations should be ongoing, ideally should be ongoing, but also tricky because, as I mentioned, grief following the death of a friend is often significantly disenfranchised. That said, I think things are changing. I think things are especially changing in younger generations, maybe younger baby boomers or Gen X on down, and I think there's more openness about the significant and sometimes even central role that friendships have in our lives. So whether it's within one's workplace or within our families or in our social circles or in talking to people who are co-grieving, like family members of our friend, I think it's important that we own our losses without stepping on the loss of someone else, and to really keep central the remembrance that after one death, there are many, many, many losses, again, because every relationship was unique. And to be able to have conversations that demonstrate and validate the importance of the relationship with the person who has died, and consequently that we are all grieving, is really helpful. And I think it takes a lot of care, and I think it takes patience. I think some of the the most healthy and helpful co-grieving happens when people who are grieving together also have supports from outside that circle of grievers, so that they can go to also people in their lives, professional or, other friends who maybe were not impacted by that loss, so that they feel that one-on-one support when they need it, and then can take that support with them when going back to the circle of grievers and being able to have conversations with them, which will also mitigate risks of competitive grieving, because, we all want to be recognized in our grief. We all want to be heard. We all want to be validated, whatever our unique emotional responses to the loss are. And if we're getting that validation from other people, we might not feel as needy about it when we're working with or, trying to support and help the people who are co-grieving with us. But it does take patience and care, and I think it takes care with our language to ensure that everybody impacted by the loss is being met where they are and being supported with the unique tools that maybe they need that aren't going to look replicable from one person to the next.
Do you have suggestions on ways that we can honor our friend that we've lost to help us through our own grief journey?
I think it's important to memorialize the friends in our lives who have died, and I think it's also important, just as we would recommend for the loss of a family member, to remember that we get to continue bonds with our dead, and to try to make meaning out of the loss itself. I certainly still have regular conversations with friends who have mutually lost a friend with me, and I think that also being able to keep those memories alive, even in very anecdotal ways, like, oh my gosh, she had the best laugh, remember the time this hysterical thing happened, that it doesn't always have to be this active grief processing. It can also be a way to carry them with us, just as we would if we had lost somebody who was, a family member. And I think also, being able to participate maybe more publicly in conversations about loss and grief and death, and to be able to model for others that you do have a right to honor the death of a friend, and you do have the right to honor their life, also really important. But in keeping those memories going and being transparent about them, and being transparent also about what you now are missing in your life with this person no longer alive, is also a way to honor the dead, and not to simply relegate them to having a status of being in the past tense of your life, but that you are still carrying things from them with you. And I think that can also be really valuable in making meaning of our losses, and know that we are carrying our loved one with us, and that, again, our loved ones are not simply, what society deems should be the most important people in our lives, and to be transparent about it is very important. I talk about losses in my own life with my students, and part of the reason I do that is, it's all pedagogical, it's all for teaching purposes, but it's also to show them that they get to own their losses. I'm currently teaching an honors seminar of 20 students where literally half of my class has lost a friend to suicide, and once they realize that they can talk about their friends, that they can talk about their anger or their sense of being guilty or upset, or, again, like the funny things that happened together, or when they went to prom, at the same time, and they can break those silences, they also get to then honor their dead in a way that they probably weren't encouraged to by the families when this person died, because they were, quote, just the friends. So, remembering we get to carry our dead with us, I think, is incredibly important when we look at this category of loss.
Sara, you mentioned support groups. Are there any support groups that are specific to this kind of loss, the loss of a friend?
There really aren't, to my knowledge, any kind of nationally recognized or even, chapters of organizations that provide grief support that are specific to friendship, and I think that's detrimental. Certainly as a college educator, I would like to see more supports both at, the college and university level and in high schools for people who are losing friends, but I think that doesn't mean that if we lose a friend, we couldn't maybe organize something ourselves, maybe get something together with other co-grievers and make it a coffee hour where we're able to just talk about memories of our loved one and be present and validate one another in our grieving. There are, of course, a lot of support groups that are specific to a means of death, suicide death loss support groups, overdose and addiction death loss support groups. And then there are categorical support groups, whether they're in churches or in community centers for, say, the death of a parent or the death of a partner or the death of a child. We really don't see ones that are surrounding the death of a friend. And maybe part of the reason is that dominant culture tends to overlook this category of loss. Maybe it's also in part because some of the best supports we could be getting are either from co-grievers of the same loss or people that we are individually reaching out to in our lives who are going to validate that loss for us.
Sara, who are you remembering today?
If we were recording last week as initially planned, I intended here to talk about a couple of my own friends who have died, and I am certainly remembering them today throughout this conversation. However, as we are recording 3 days after the massacre at Club Q in Colorado Springs, Colorado, an LGBTQ+ space, I am thinking very much about the lives lost in that brutal rampage. Much of what I learned about the potential to create and build my own chosen family over my lifetime, I learned from LGBTQ+ friends who became my rainbow family. I think it's crucial to acknowledge that while the families of those who were killed are grieving losses they never should have experienced, their friends, their chosen family, their community are all grieving profoundly right now as well. And as our allies and members of the queer community, as an ally to the queer community, I feel a deep sense of grief, having never met these amazing young adults while they were alive. So they are at the forefront of my mind and have been since the news broke of this massacre.
Certainly a lot of friends were lost. Thank you so much, Sara, for joining me today and for talking about this very specific loss that, as you said, is often overlooked, and perhaps one day those specific support groups will pop up for us.
That would be wonderful, absolutely. And as always, thank you for having me. It's always good to be back.
To learn more about healing and loss following a death, visit rememberingalife.com.